It began on a Tuesday. I remember the day with a strange, crystalline clarity, not because of any grand event, but because Tuesday was the day I always watered the ferns on the balcony. It was mid-August, and the city was suffering under a heat wave that felt less like weather and more like a physical presence, a heavy, invisible shroud that had wrapped itself around the brick and mortar of the suburb. I was standing in the center of my living room. I had just finished a cup of coffee, and the empty ceramic mug felt heavy in my right hand. It was a simple, mundane object, but in the silence of that afternoon, I became acutely aware of its texture, the slight grain of the unglazed bottom, the cooling porcelain against my palm, the faint, bitter scent of the dregs still clinging to the inside. I didn't move. I simply stood there. The light in the room was a thick, syrupy gold. It poured in through the west-facing window, illuminating a diagonal strip of the old hardwood floor. Inside that beam of light, I saw a single mote of dust. It was an insignificant speck, a tiny fragment of skin or fabric, but it moved with such a languid, erratic grace that it caught my eye. It drifted upward, then swirled in a microscopic current, caught in a dance that seemed to have no beginning and no end. I watched it for what I thought was a second, but then I noticed the shadows on the wall had shifted. They had grown longer, stretching out like dark fingers toward the velvet armchair. How long had I been looking at that speck? 10 minutes? 20? I tried to tell myself to set the mug down. The coffee table was only 3 feet away. I could see the faint ring of a water stain on its surface, a reminder of a drink I'd had weeks ago. I planned the movement in my head, the subtle shift of my weight to the balls of my feet, the extension of my elbow, the release of my grip, but the plan remained only a thought. My muscles felt strangely dense, as if the humidity in the room had seeped into my fibers, turning them from elastic thread into heavy, dampened rope. It wasn't that I was paralyzed, at least, not then. It was more that the very idea of movement seemed intrusive. To move would be to break the perfect, golden equilibrium of the room. It would be an act of violence against the stillness. I listened to the house. When you stand still for long enough, the house begins to speak. I heard the refrigerator in the kitchen, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. It was a deep, grounding sound. Below that, I heard the settling of the building, a tiny creak from the rafters that sounded like a groan of relief. Outside, the world was a distant, muffled roar, the hiss of tires on melting asphalt, the faint, metallic clang of a construction site 3 blocks away. But those sounds felt like they belonged to another planet. They were noise. Here, in the center of the room, there was only the signal. I felt a bead of sweat form at my temple. I felt it move. It was an agonizingly slow journey. I felt the salt and the heat of it as it rolled down past my eye, tracing the curve of my cheekbone, hanging for an eternity at the edge of my jaw before finally falling. I didn't reach up to wipe it away. The effort of raising my arm felt like trying to lift a mountain. Why am I still standing here? I asked myself. The question echoed in my mind, but it didn't spark a reaction. It was just another piece of data, no more important than the dust mote or the hum of the fridge. I began to wonder about the nature of a moment. We think of time as a line, a frantic rush from one point to the next. Time felt like a pool. It was stagnant. It was deep, and I was slowly sinking into the bottom of it. I looked at my hand again. The knuckles were white from gripping the mug. I realized I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. They had become an extension of the ceramic. I was no longer a man holding a cup. I was a singular object, a sculpture titled The Afternoon. A fly landed on the rim of the mug. It was a frantic, twitching creature. It rubbed its legs together with a sound that seemed like a scream in the silence. It walked across my thumb, its tiny, hooked feet pricking my skin. In any other circumstance, I would have flinched. Now I simply observed the sensation. I analyzed the pressure, the way the fly's wings caught the light, the frantic rhythm of its life. It was so fast, so temporary. The sun dipped lower. The golden light turned to a bruised, heavy orange. The shadows finally reached the armchair and began to climb its legs. The room grew colder, a sharp, dry chill that smelled of old books and undisturbed corners. I realized then that I had been standing in that exact spot for nearly 3 hours. I wasn't scared. That was the most unsettling part. I felt a profound sense of relief. For 34 years, I had been moving. I had been walking, running, reaching, grasping. And for what? To end up in a room, in a city, in a body that was always tired. Standing still was the first honest thing I had ever done. I felt my heart beat once. It was a heavy, slow thud that seemed to echo through the entire apartment. I waited for the next one. I waited for a long time. I realized I was standing still. And for the first time in my life, I realized I never wanted to move again. The sun eventually surrendered to the horizon, leaving behind a sky the color of a fading bruise, deep purples and jagged grays that bled into the room. I watched the transition from my stationary vigil, my eyes wide and dry. I had stopped blinking some time ago. The moisture on my corneas had evaporated, leaving behind a thin, glassy film that made the world look like it was viewed through an old camera lens. I became aware of a new sensation. It wasn't the stiffness of a tired muscle, but something far more structural. It began in my knees. I could feel the synovial fluid, the natural lubricant of the joints, beginning to thicken. It felt like cool, liquid wax was being injected into the gaps between my bones. It didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like a stabilization. My legs were no longer two pillars of flesh and bone struggling against gravity. They were becoming part of the architecture. I felt a strange, tectonic pressure as my weight settled. The floorboards beneath my feet didn't just creak. They groaned with a slow, wooden finality, as if they were finally accepting a load they had been expecting for decades. I am settling, I thought. The word echoed in the hollows of my mind like a stone dropped into a deep well. The twilight deepened. The objects in my living room began to lose their edges, dissolving into the increasing gloom. The velvet armchair, once a comforting haven, now looked like a hunched, prehistoric beast, its fabric absorbing what little light remained. The smell of the room changed too. The lingering scent of coffee had vanished, replaced by a dry, mineral odor, the smell of dust, of cold plaster, and of things that have remained undisturbed for a very long time. I tried to shift my weight, just an inch, just to prove to the silence that I still held the keys to my own machinery. The effort was catastrophic. I felt the tendons in my ankles stretch with a sound like dry parchment tearing. My muscles didn't slide, they ground against one another. It took what felt like an hour of mental exertion to move my center of gravity a fraction of a centimeter. When I finally stopped, the vibration of the movement hummed through my skeletal frame for minutes afterward. It was a warning. The store of energy required to move was being depleted, replaced by a heavy, calcified inertia. My right arm, still holding the mug, had lost all feeling. The ceramic was no longer a foreign object held in my grip. It was a growth. I could feel the microscopic pores of the clay beginning to interface with the calluses on my palm. We were fusing. I imagined my blood slowing down, turning into a thick, dark resin that moved only when the moon pulled at the tide. Why am I not afraid? The question surfaced, bobbing briefly on the surface of my consciousness before sinking. Fear is a high-energy emotion. It requires a racing heart, a flush of heat, the frantic firing of synapses. But my heart had slowed to a rhythmic, heavy thud, one beat every 30 seconds. Each pulse was a deliberate, mechanical act. I was no longer a biological entity driven by impulse. I was a clock. A slow, geological clock measuring the erosion of the afternoon. I looked at the window. A moth had found its way inside, drawn by the faint, ghostly reflection of the moon on the glass. It flew in frantic, jagged patterns, its wings beating against the air with a sound like velvet fans. It landed on my shoulder. I felt the microscopic weight of it. In the old world, I would have brushed it off with a mindless flick of the wrist. Now I simply watched it. I felt the tiny, hair-like legs treading on the fabric of my shirt, then onto the skin of my neck. It stayed there for a long time, its wings shivering in the dark. I realized that to the moth, I was a mountain. I was an outcropping of stone, a permanent feature of the geography. I felt a profound sense of pride. I was a host. I was a sanctuary for the small and the fleeting. The air in the apartment grew colder. The heating system didn't kick in. Perhaps I had forgotten to set the thermostat, or perhaps the house knew that its guest no longer required warmth. My skin temperature dropped to match the room. I was equilibrating. The boundary between Elias and the apartment was thinning. I wasn't just standing in the room anymore. I was beginning to stand as the room. I thought of my ferns on the balcony. In the darkness, I could almost hear them. The soil in their pots would be cracking, the moisture retreating from the roots as the heat of the day lingered in the clay. They were dying. A small, pathetic part of my mind tried to scream. It tried to remind me of my duty to the living things in my care. But the thought was too fast, too jagged. It didn't fit the rhythm of the stone. I watched the thought pass, a tiny spark of light that vanished into the gray. The moth on my neck stopped shivering. It folded its wings and became still. I looked at the far wall. The shadows were now absolute. "I am still here," I tried to say. But my vocal cords felt like rusted wires. The words didn't leave my throat. They stayed inside, vibrating against my chest, a secret kept by a statue. I realized then that the stillness wasn't something happening to me. It was something I was finally allowing to happen. I was a puzzle piece that had finally found its slot. The moth died on my shoulder sometime before dawn. I felt its life flicker out, a tiny, insignificant cooling, and I welcomed its brittle body to the silt that was beginning to cover me. I realized I was standing still, and the world was finally beginning to forget I was ever there to move. The second day didn't arrive with the sun. It arrived with a shift in the quality of the gray. The light that eventually filtered through the grime on the windows was sickly and thin, a pale yellow that lacked any warmth. It crawled across the carpet with a tectonic slowness, highlighting things I had lived with for years but never truly seen. From my fixed perspective, I became an expert on the geography of my own floor. I saw the way the dust had gathered into small, woolly drifts against the baseboards. I saw a single, forgotten staple embedded in the wood, its silver back glinting like a needle in the gloom. My mind began to perform a strange, rhythmic editing of my history. I tried to remember the sound of a voice, perhaps a friend or the woman who used to live in the apartment next door. But the memory was too loud, too chaotic for the current state of the room. Every time I tried to conjure a human face, the image was immediately overwritten by the texture of the wall in front of me. I found myself obsessing over a tiny bubble in the white latex paint, a blister the size of a grain of rice that had been growing, unseen, for 5 years. The paint is honest, I thought. The memory is noise. I began to categorize my life not by events, but by shadows. There was the shadow of the armchair, which indicated the arrival of the mid-morning. There was the shadow of the floor lamp, which marked the slow descent into the afternoon. My personal history was being replaced by the history of the house. I no longer remembered my university graduation or my first job. Instead, I remembered the exact moment 3 years ago when the ceiling had developed a faint, hairline fracture near the light fixture. I was becoming a repository for the building's secrets. Around midday, I felt the first true sign of the settlement reaching my core. A thin layer of silt, a mixture of skin cells, fabric fibers, and microscopic urban soot, had begun to settle on my shoulders and the top of my head. I could feel it. It was a weightless weight, a million tiny anchors claiming me for the earth. I didn't want to brush it off. To move would be to interrupt the slow, beautiful accumulation of time. It would be an insult to the dust. Then, a sound broke the sanctuary. Giggle. I froze, or rather, I remained frozen, but my internal gears ground to a halt. It was a bird. A sparrow had landed on the railing of the balcony just outside the glass doors. It was a frantic, twitching thing, its head darting back and forth with a terrifying, high-speed energy. It looked through the glass, its black, bead-like eye reflecting the interior of the room. It didn't see Elias. It saw an upright shape, a pillar of salt, a feature of the cave. The bird chirped, a sharp, piercing sound that felt like a needle being driven into my crystalline eardrums. The sound echoed in the hollows of my chest, vibrating against my parchment-dry lungs. Then it flew away. The sound of its wings was a violent, percussive flapping that left a ringing silence in its wake. I felt a ghost of a regret. The ferns. In the heat of the second day, I could feel the life leaving them. I could almost hear the cells in their fronds collapsing, the moisture retreating from the green tips, turning them into brittle, brown skeletons. They were reaching for the water I would never give them. The thought of their thirst was a sharp, jagged edge in the smooth gray of my mind. I tried to reach for the emotion of pity, but my internal clockwork was too slow. By the time I had processed the concept of a dying plant, the feeling had already calcified. The pity turned into a mineral fact. The ferns are dying. The sun is moving. I am standing. My thought process was now separated by hours of silence. Drop. The light is on the staple. Long silence. Drop. My knuckles are the color of bone. Long silence. Drop. I cannot remember my mother's name. I tried to fight the last one. I reached back into the dark corners of my brain, searching for her face, for the smell of the perfume she wore, for the way she used to call me from the kitchen. But the house wouldn't allow it. Every time I reached for Mother, the hum of the refrigerator surged, drowning out the memory with its steady, 60-cycle vibration. The house was jealous. It wanted to be the only mother I had left. I looked at the mug in my hand. A hairline crack had appeared in the ceramic, starting at the rim and snaking down toward the base. It was a result of the room's temperature fluctuations. The mug was aging. The mug was breaking. And so was I. I could feel my skin tightening, stretching over my cheekbones until it felt like thin, dry drum skin. My eyelids had finally fused. I no longer had the ability to shut out the world. I was a permanent witness to the bubbling paint and the drifting dust. I realized then that the first crack hadn't been a mistake. It had been an invitation. The apartment wasn't a prison, it was a mold. And I was finally beginning to fit. I watched a spider begin to weave a web between my left hip and the edge of the coffee table. It moved with a frantic, industrial speed, its silver threads catching the dying light of the second day. I felt the first thread touch my trousers. I felt the second touch the wood. I was the anchor. I was the bridge. I realized I was standing still. And for the first time, I understood that I wasn't waiting for the end. I was waiting for the beginning of the stone. The third day brought a shift in the atmosphere. The stagnant humidity of the heat wave finally broke, replaced by a dry, chilling wind that rattled the window panes in their frames. I felt the house groaning around me, not a groan of pain but a deep, structural sigh. It was the sound of old wood contracting, of copper pipes cooling, of the building leaning its massive, weary weight back into the earth. It was a symphony of architectural sounds, and I realized, with a thrill of cold clarity, that I was now the lead instrument. My spine had begun to fuse with the air behind me. I could no longer feel the individual vertebrae. They had become a solid, vertical axis around which the apartment turned. I was no longer a person standing in a room. I was the room's center of gravity. I began to contemplate the error. The error wasn't that I had stood still for too long. The error was the realization that I had never truly moved at all. All those years of walking to the office, of traveling to other cities, of dancing, of running, it was all a frantic, blurry illusion. I had been standing still my entire life, trapped in the cage of my own skin, screaming silently while my body performed the theater of motion. The only difference now was that I had stopped pretending. I had finally achieved the honesty of the armchair. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't a heartbeat. The wet, rhythmic thumping of a biological heart was gone, replaced by something more precise. It was a tick. My internal organs had undergone a sea change. My heart had hardened into a crystalline pump. My lungs were no longer soft, pink sponges. They were two stiff bellows made of ancient parchment, expanding only once every 20 minutes. My blood had thickened into a slow-moving resin, a dark, viscous amber that moved through my veins only when the moon exerted its gravitational pull on the tides. I was a clock, a slow, heavy, geological clock, measuring the erosion of my own existence. I watched a fly land on my forearm. In the old world, I would have swatted it away with an instinctive flick of the wrist. Now, I watched it with the detached curiosity of a mountain watching a cloud. It walked across the marble of my skin, its tiny, hooked legs tickling the dormant nerves beneath the surface. It explored the valley of my elbow, tasted the salt of my history. It stayed there for a full cycle of the sun. I didn't mind. I was a host. I was a monument. Eventually, the fly died. I felt its tiny, brittle body go cold against my skin. I watched its wings turn to a fine, iridescent dust over the course of several hours. I watched it become part of the gray silt that now covered my shoulders like a funeral shroud. I realized then that I was winning. The world wanted me to be messy and temporary, but I was choosing the signal of the stone. Then, the world tried to fight back. A sound came from the hallway, a key sliding into a lock. The sound was like a thunderclap in the absolute silence of the tomb. It shattered the equilibrium of the apartment, sending ripples of genuine agony through my fused joints. I felt a surge of ancient, forgotten adrenaline, a noise that my system tried desperately to filter out. My crystalline heart gave a single, violent talk. The door swung open. Light from the hallway flooded in, a harsh, artificial yellow that felt like concentrated acid against my dry, unblinking eyes. A man walked in. He was wearing a blue uniform with a name patch I couldn't read. He smelled of tobacco, sweat, and the frantic, oily world of the outside. "Maintenance," he said. His voice was a landslide of sound, a chaotic, terrifying roar that lacked any rhythm. He didn't see me at first. He walked into the kitchen, his boots making a disgusting, wet slap on the tiles. He checked the sink. He walked past me to the balcony. "Plants are dead," he muttered. He sounded annoyed, as if the ferns had died just to spite him. Then, he turned around. He stopped. The air in the room seemed to freeze around him. He looked at me. I saw his face go through a rapid, high-speed evolution of expressions. Confusion, then curiosity, and finally, a deep, primal realization. He didn't see a man named Elias. He saw a shape. He saw something that didn't belong in the center of a living room. He walked toward me, his movements jerky and erratic, like a broken film reel. He reached out a hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him to stay away, to warn him that he was disturbing a composition that had taken eons to perfect. I wanted to tell him that his heat was a poison. But my mouth was a sealed seam of dry, gray skin. He touched my shoulder. His hand was warm. It was horribly, disgustingly warm. The heat of his life flowed into my cold, mineral shoulder, a violent, thumping intrusion of noise into my perfect signal. I felt a crack, a real, physical crack that started at my collarbone and raced down my chest like a lightning bolt. I was breaking. The statue was failing. "What the hell?" he whispered, his breath smelling of peppermint and rot. He pulled his hand back, and I felt the air rush into the fissure in my chest. In that moment, I had a final, fleeting choice. I could fight the breaking. I could try to force my resin-filled lungs to scream, to reach out and grab him, to drag myself back into the world of the living, into the world of heat and noise and pain. Or I could let the crack finish its work. I looked at the bubbling paint on the wall. I looked at the dust mote, still dancing in the sliver of hallway light. I chose the paint. The maintenance man backed away. his boots scuffing the floor with a sound that felt like sandpaper on my nerve. I watched him through the hazy, unblinking film of my eyes. He was fumbling with a device in his pocket, his phone. The light from its screen was a sharp, blue needle in the dimness of the apartment. "Yeah, I don't know what it is," he was saying into the phone. His voice was trembling, the pitch fluctuating in a way that offended the stillness. "It looks like a statue. Some kind of art piece? But it's right in the middle of the floor. No, I didn't see anyone. The tenant is MIA. The place smells like a basement. Send Miller up here." He left the apartment to wait in the hallway, leaving the door ajar. A draft blew in from the corridor. It was a cold, restless wind that smelled of the rest of the building, of other people's cooking, of floor cleaner, of the chaotic, moving lives of 100 other souls. It swirled around my legs, tugging at the layer of silt on my shoulders, trying to pull me back into the stream of time. I felt the crack in my chest widening. It was a deep, jagged canyon that split my torso. I could see inside myself now. I wasn't made of meat and bone anymore. My interior was a labyrinth of gray gears, silver wires, and calcified resin, all frozen in a moment of perfect, crystalline stasis. I was an intricate clockwork that had decided to stop ticking. I looked at the open door. Beyond that rectangle of yellow light was the hallway. Beyond the hallway was the elevator. Beyond the elevator was the street, the sun, the rain, and the messy, beautiful noise of being alive. I could leave. I could force my frozen, marble-like legs to move. I could shatter the gray skin that encased me, stepping out of the statue like a moth emerging from a cocoon. I would be a broken thing, a creature made of shards and resin, but I would be moving. I would be part of the chaos again. I would have to speak. I would have to eat. I would have to feel the crushing weight of tomorrow. I thought about the street. I thought about the smell of car exhaust and the exhausting pressure of having to be someone. Then, I looked at the velvet armchair. It was so perfectly still. It didn't have to explain itself. It didn't have to apologize for its existence. It was simply a chair, occupying its space with a quiet, undeniable dignity. It didn't worry about the future. It didn't mourn the past. It just was. I felt a wave of profound, heavy peace wash over me. I didn't want the street. I didn't want the noise. I didn't want the burden of a heartbeat that was always rushing toward its own end. I leaned back. Not with my body. My body was an immovable pillar, but with my soul. I leaned back into the architecture of the apartment. I leaned back into the shadows. I chose the silence. The maintenance man returned. He was accompanied by a second man, older, with a heavy tread and a sigh that sounded like a leaking tire. "See?" the first man said, pointing a shaking finger at me. "It wasn't here during the last inspection. It's like a column, or a sculpture." But the landlord didn't say anything about a delivery. The second man, Miller, walked around me. He was close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He reached out and touched the ceramic mug that was now a permanent part of my hand. "It's solid," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "Feels like some kind of composite resin. Heavy as hell. Why would anyone leave a 6-foot pillar of gray gunk in the middle of a living room?" "Maybe it's an art thing," the first man replied. "You know how these people are. They call it minimalism or something." I watched them. I watched the way their eyes darted around, never staying on one thing for more than a second. They were so fast. They were so temporary. They were like sparks from a fire, bright for a moment, then gone forever. I felt a surge of pity for them. They were trapped in the frantic theater of motion, while I had found the exit. "We need to move it," Miller said, wiping his brow. "The new tenant moves in on Friday. We can't have this thing obstructing the flow of the room. Get the dolly." They brought in a heavy, metal hand truck. Miller tilted it forward, wedging the steel plate beneath the heels of my feet. He braced his foot against the axle and pulled back. I felt the foundation of my existence groan. The floorboards screamed as my rooted feet were tugged. I didn't fight him. I didn't resist. I simply became heavier. I tapped into the weight of the building. I tapped into the weight of the concrete and the steel and the earth beneath the foundation. I became a mountain of gray gunk. I became an immovable object. Miller grunted, his face turning a deep, angry red. He pulled with all his might, the metal of the dolly creaking under the strain. It's stuck," he gasped, letting go. The dolly clattered to the floor. "It's like it's bolted through the floorboards into the joists. I can't even budge it an inch." I felt a surge of profound satisfaction, the slow, deep victory of a rock that has successfully resisted the river. "Fine," Miller spat, looking at me with a mixture of fear and disgust. "If we can't move it, we break it. Go get the sledgehammer from the truck." I looked at him. I saw the sweat on his forehead. I saw the frantic pulse in his neck. I smiled, though my face remained a mask of gray stone. The choice was made. I was no longer Elias. I was the stillness, and the stillness was ready for the hammer. The sledgehammer hit my chest at exactly 2:14 p.m. on Thursday. The sound was not a wet thud of impact. It was a clear, ringing chime, like a hammer striking a massive tuning fork made of frozen glass. The vibration traveled through me in an instant, echoing in the hollow, resin-filled chambers of my heart. I didn't feel pain. Pain is a message for the living, a warning to move, to flinch, to heal. I was beyond healing. I felt only a sense of completion. With every blow, a piece of the old me fell away. A shard of my left shoulder hit the rug with a muffled clink. A fragment of my right arm, still fused to the ceramic handle of the mug, shattered onto the coffee table like a dropped plate. A large section of my chest turned to a fine, gray dust that billowed up, coating the maintenance man's boots and settling into the creases of his uniform. Miller was breathing hard now, his chest heaving with a frantic, animal exertion. He was cursing, his voice a ragged snarl against the silence. He thought he was winning. He thought he was destroying a nuisance in the middle of a room. But as he broke me, he was only helping me fulfill my final purpose. He was spreading me. The shards of my body were no longer confined to a single, vertical axis. I was in the rug. I was on the table. I was in the air, a microscopic, gray silt that the men were inhaling with every desperate breath. I was entering their lungs. I was becoming part of their blood. I was no longer a column. I was the atmosphere. They eventually gave up. My core, the part of me that had tapped into the very foundation of the building, remained immovable. It was a jagged, waist-high stump of petrified time, rooted into the joist. They decided it was too costly to remove, too difficult to explain. "Build a box over it," Miller muttered, wiping gray dust from his forehead. "A wooden pedestal. We'll tell the landlord it's a decorative feature. A place for a plant or something. Just cover it up." They built the box on Friday morning. I felt the vibration of the nails being driven into the wood around me. Each strike was a lullaby. They enclosed me in a dark, quiet chamber of plywood and mahogany stain. I was finally, truly, in the dark. The new tenant moved in on Saturday. She was a young woman with a frantic energy. She carried boxes of books, a humming record player, and a collection of plants that looked thirsty from the move. She noticed the wooden pedestal in the center of the room and paused. She touched the wood with a warm, soft hand. I felt the heat of her through the box, but it no longer disturbed me. I was deep underground now. She placed a fern on top of the pedestal. Every Tuesday, she watered it. I felt the moisture seeping through the cracks in the wood, soaking into the gray, petrified remains of my feet. It was cold. It was refreshing. It was the only thing I had ever truly needed. Years passed. I watched her life through the cracks in the wood and the dust in the air. I watched her move through the room with that frantic, human speed, always rushing, always searching, always noisy. I watched her grow old. I watched her eventually pack her boxes and move away. I am still here. I am the silence that greets every new tenant. I am the reason the room feels heavy to some and peaceful to others. I am the dust on the windowsills that returns an hour after it's been wiped away. I am the groan in the floorboards when the wind blows from the west. I realized I was standing still for too long. And now I realize that too long was only the beginning of forever. The house is quiet now. The sun is moving across the floor in a long, golden rectangle. I am waiting for the dust mote to return. I am not Elias. I am the stillness. And the stillness is everything.